Very good. Well, I heard the noon whistle here at Fort Atkinson, so this is my opportunity to say that I'm Steve Larson with the HOARDS Dairyman staff here in Wisconsin. We're glad to have quite a number of you with us today. We're looking forward to our webinar. The subject, as you can see, is an update on some repro technologies and protocols. We're looking forward to that presentation by Dr. Scott Poock. And we want to thank the sponsor of today's webinar, PARNELL. And also, we always want to say thanks and hi to our partners down there, Mike Hutchins at the University of Illinois, and also Jim Baltz, who works with him down there on some of the technical aspects of our webinars. And then we always appreciate the help here at HOARDS Dairyman of Patty Hirchin, who does a lot of work on the webinar series as well. So welcome. One thought before I turn it over to Mike to further introduce our speaker today is to point out that the handouts are available in a PDF format. You can print them out now or anytime during the webinar if you want to have copies now and use them to follow along or make notes rather than on the screen. So that option is available. You can look at your menu there on the right-hand side under handouts, and you'll see the PowerPoint icon. And with those comments, I will now ask Mike Hutchins, our co-host down there, to introduce the presenter today and get the webinar started.
Well, thanks very much, Steve, and it's my personal and professional pleasure to introduce Dr. Scott Poock to our listening audience here for our webinar here today. Scott grew up in Shawano County, Wisconsin, of all places there, and he's a proud Packer fan. Even though they lost yesterday, he's still proud of them at this point. He went to school at the University of Wisconsin River Falls, and then went to the school, over to the School of Veterinary Medicine at the University of Madison. In fact, was one of the first classes admitted over there when they started their vet school. For 19 years, he worked as a veterinarian in Wisconsin, and then he continued on and became board certified in the American Board of Veterinary Practitioners for both beef and dairy cattle. In 2006, he joined the University of Missouri as extension veterinarian, where he's an associate professor. So, Scott, we're very pleased to have you on our program here today, and we'll turn the microphone over to you. Way to go, Scott.
All right. Well, thank you very much. I'm very glad to be presenting today. And I am a native Wisconsinite and have moved down here, like Dr. Hutchins has mentioned. I'll give Matt Lucy, Dr. Lucy here at University of Missouri, some credit. Some of the slides are going to be from him, and you heard from him about a year ago. But we're going to talk a little bit about some update on the protocols, estrus synchronization protocols, as well as some new reproductive technologies. And so just a little outline. I'm going to give you a little bit of background in the history of the fertility of the dairy cow, where we got the synchronization programs and evolved into the pre-synchronization programs. And then in regard to resynchronization, we're going to talk about pregnancy diagnosis, because you need a pregnancy diagnosis to then resynchronize the cows. Obviously, you don't want to resynchronize a pregnant cow. Now, I spent a little more time on activity monitors, because that's kind of the newer technology that's coming out. And then down the road, the inline monitoring is going to be coming out. It's in Canada now and not in the United States, but that could be down the road. And then as my veterinarian comes out, and I'll talk a little bit about the health of the cow and subsequent reproduction. I show this slide, this picture on this slide, and this is with my first group of production medicine kids, and we are following their GPS. And the point is, you know, when we're looking at new things, we have to try new things, and we may go down a road where maybe we shouldn't continue, but we have to try things, and so that's the purpose of that picture. And so here, we're going to start out with the first poll. I'm boarded in both beef and dairy cattle practice, and so I talk to both beef and dairy producers. And if I've got a mixed group and I tell them about fertility in dairy cows, sometimes they fall off their seat because they think, oh my goodness, that's terrible. But here, just to begin with, what are you seeing on your dairy farms? And, you know, are they improving, worsening, or no change in the last 15 years?
Well, Steve, how are you going to vote out there at HOARDS Dairyman? What's the word out of HOARDS Farm?
I'm going to go for improving. I think for a couple of reasons. I think we're learning more about the, you know, some of the protocols to get cows bred. I think we've got some new technology, and then the other thing is that we've been using daughter pregnancy rate, you know, as part of our genetic selection here for a while. So that'd be my choice. But let's see what the others are going to say.
Well, we must have a lot of Republicans online today because it's really slow coming in.
Voting slow.
Yeah, I tell you, they must be waiting for the big debate that's coming up this week. That's all I can figure out. It looks like we're at a minute. Let's close this off and post it. And Scott, what's your impression?
Well, I would have expected most people to say that it's improving, and I will show you some data from farms showing that it has improved on those farms, some of my former clients, and here at the University of Missouri. So I'm glad to see that a majority are saying it's improving. So, and maybe for those that say it's worsening or it's no change, hopefully we'll give you some ideas to improve things as we move forward. Okay, so a little history. If we look at genetically, and Dr. Lucy had shown these graphs, and from the 1950s to about 2000, 2001, we saw a steady decline in genetics of reproduction. However, since that time, we've seen a swing upward, and so this is a good trend, and I think as we go through, you'll see how we've begun to improve fertility in our dairy cows today. So, historically, one of the reasons why fertility maybe has gone down is due to estrus expression. And you can see here, I show these groups of dairy cows. They're Holsteins and confinement dairy. Dairy heifers are Holstein heifers, and the beef cows were primary Angus cross cows. They were all synchronized very similarly. They're all during one fall season, not on the same farms, but you can see using these estrotech patches, the difference between expression of heat. And we knew these cows were in heat because of blood samples, but you can see how much more the beef cow or even the dairy heifer expresses, and you have the estrotech patch rubbed off. And so this decline in estrus expression is not solely, do we see it necessarily just in confinement dairies, but there's data from Ireland that shows even on the grazing cows we're seeing less expression. And it doesn't matter whether it's a Holstein or Jersey. Steve Washburn from North Carolina State had shown that there's a decline in estrus expression in Jerseys as well as Holsteins. So that's been the history. And then we move on to synchronization. What's the history of that? And you know, years ago we just detected estrus or heat. We watched for it, and the man leading the cow in the picture, I can remember my grandpa talking about when his cow was in heat, when he was going through school, his family cow, he'd take it up to past St. Paul Church in Wittenberg, Wisconsin, to the place there they had a Guernsey bull, and he'd leave her there and then go to school and then come back and bring her back. Then probably in the 70s, 80s, we started doing targeted breeding where we'd use prostaglandin, and we would try to group cows coming in heat at a time. And then when we got to the 90s, we saw Ovsynch come about, and followed that pre-sync and resync, and then finally to the CIDR, where we have some data using that. So that's kind of the history of the synchronization protocols that we've seen. And so what has synchronization done? And so this is a herd, it used to be a client of mine, and I began working with them. And if you can see here this is a scatter graph. This is days in first breeding, and this is calving date. Most recent on this end, longest at this end. And you can see each dot is, so this cow that I'm showing here was roughly about 140 days in milk when she was bred for the first time. And so we start working with this herd, and at this time, with this kind of scatter graph, they had 11% preg rate. Well, we went to a pre-sync Ovsynch program, and these cows are being bred off the second prostaglandin, so they're cherry picking, and then these cows are the Ovsynch. And I'm not showing this, but if we went and looked a year later, their pregnancy rate had jumped to 22%. So basically, we doubled the number of pregnancies every 21 days in this herd by going to the synchronization program. Now, I want you to kind of keep in mind this section, okay, of the graph, because I'm going to show you another graph later, but just kind of keep in mind in this versus what this looks like. So what synchronization programs are out there? So the Dairy Cattle Reproduction Council, you see the panel there and the website. You can go there and get the protocols. And for the OVSyncs, there's OVSync 48, OVSync 56, CoSync 72, and 5-day CoSync 72. And so those are all the recommended ones that are on their protocol list. And I show OVSync 56 because it is probably the most popular and the one that's probably researched the most, and we seem to get higher pregnancies per AI utilizing that one versus the other ones. And so it's just laid out there. So on, just for example, on a Monday you give a GnRH, a week later you give prostaglandin, then 56 hours later, that's OVSync 56, you give GnRH, 16 hours later you breed them. So that's the OVSync. Now, we started using those, and then we said, well, you know, when should we really start an OVSync, part of the estrus cycle? And you can see here on the bottom, we have the 21-day estrus cycle, and it's showing we now know cows have 2 waves of follicles. And what we found is that if we start that OVSync in days 5 to 10 of the cycle, so you see where it's optimum, we're likely to ovulate that dominant follicle and start a new wave. And so it's really best to breed when you have that second dominant follicle, or the second wave dominant follicle, okay? And if you don't ovulate to that first GnRH, your pregnancies per AI decrease and your embryo quality decreases. So then it's, how do we get that? How do we get more cows in days 5 to 10 of the estrus cycle? And that's where pre-synchronization comes into effect. And so pre-synchronization increases the chance of the cow being in the day 5 to 10 of the estrus cycle at the start of the OVSync, okay? And that subsequently will increase your pregnancies per AI. And it does it by making sure more cows ovulate to that first GnRH, and it also increases the progesterone levels at the start, which will lead to increase in pregnancies as well. So which sync protocols or pre-synchronizations are there? Once again, you can go to the DCRC website and find those, and you can download those and look at them. But really the 3 recommended pre-sync protocols are is pre-sync, and I have 11 to 14 because those are the numbers that determines from the last prostaglandin to the start of the OVSync, or you can use what's called double OVSync or G6G, all right? And here I laid those out also in a slide. So, and I'm showing you pre-sync 12. So I give a prostaglandin, 14 days later I give a second prostaglandin, and then 12 days later I start my OVSync. Double OVSync, like the name, I actually are doing 2 OVSyncs before I'm breeding. And then G6G is I give a prostaglandin, wait 2 days, give GnRH, and then 6 days later I give another GnRH. So you can see the G6G is the shortest protocol. The double OVSync's medium, and the pre-sync OVSync is the longest protocol. Now, kind of reverse of that, the pre-sync OVSync is you're only working or locking up cattle, working cattle, or sorting cattle 3 times a week. The double OVSync is 4 times a week, and the G6G is 5 times a week. So there's little differences, and depending on how the system works. From practice, I've found I've usually started with a pre-sync OVSync. A lot of times when we started getting pregnancies, then producer would say, well, how do we refine these? And then we would look at other ways of getting cows pregnant, how to fine-tune those things. So also, so how do we increase the sync potential? Now that we're getting cows pregnant, how do we get more? How do we get a higher percentage? How do we make it more efficient? And we always, when we give that prostaglandin, we need a mature CL. And a mature CL would be a CL that's 6 to 7 days old to day 17, because we know CLs that are less than 6 days of age are kind of refractory. They're not going to respond to the prostaglandin as well as if they're older. And so that has led to there's been a couple papers out in the Journal of Dairy Science supplement that has shown promise in increasing pregnancies per AI by using 2 doses of prostaglandin. And so what that means is in a normal Ovsynch, instead you'll give a prostaglandin and 24 hours later you give a second one. It's kind of like what we're doing with the 5-day programs, CIDR programs, but this is with the normal Ovsynch, and that 2 doses is regressing some of these early sales that are occurring in some of these cows that don't follow the pattern of what they're supposed to when you're synchronizing them. So that's a potential improvement of reproduction in the future. So I'm going to show you here why we might have to do that, maybe one reason, but this is a study from Laura Wilsdorf, who was a grad student of Dr. Lucy's, and what they did was they took blood samples at the time of the prostaglandin, that's -3. They took a blood sample at day 0, which is the day of breeding, 7 days later, and then 25 days later, and they're looking at progesterone. And you can see here, quite typically, what's nice, and all these animals on this graph ended up pregnant. So what we like to see is a nice V, where progesterone drops to very low, which we would expect when they're in heat, and then it rises and stays high once the cow's pregnant. So if a cow will do that, their pregnancy per AI is quite high. However, cows that don't respond like they should, and this group of cows were not pregnant after AI, and you can see some follow the pattern somewhat like they should, but most of them do not. I mean, some are low progesterone, go high, and some go low but then don't go high, and so the purpose of the study was to begin to say, well, if we find a cow that's not responding like she's supposed to along this line, can we do something different with her? And that's a potential thing that we're looking at yet. So once again, if a cow will respond like she's supposed to, pregnancy per AI is quite high. When she does this stuff like this, that's where we lose quite a bit of the conception. So what about a CIDR? Okay, so CIDRs are relatively new, the last 10, 15 years. Definitely the data would say adding a CIDR to a synchronization where we know the cows don't have a CL at the start of AI, they definitely would benefit, whether it's the first service or subsequent services, okay? And I show this picture with these. This is a pasture-based dairy. I show that because here in Missouri, where we have quite a few pasture-based dairies and where we're synchronizing, we quite commonly will use the CIDR in our program, partly because we're almost like more like a beef operation where we're seasonally calving, and so we will have some cows that probably don't have a CL when we're going to start, and we're going to help them and get them, jumpstart them and cycling with using a CIDR. So we can get cows pregnant with synchronization. We can also use it for heifers. Now, with heifers, what's typically been done in the industry is you bring a heifer into the breeding pen and you give her a prostaglandin and you watch for heats and you see her, you breed her. If she doesn't, 2 weeks later you give another prostaglandin. That's quite common. Some producers, large heifer growers here in Missouri, will use MGA. That's a feed additive of progesterone, similar to what's in a CIDR. And you can feed that and then you can use the synchronization. Now, I have down here a 5-day CIDR program and a 14-day CIDR program. I'll show you the layouts in the next slide. They're less common. They're quite common in the beef industry, as I got the picture there. Beef producers who are using AI will use CIDRs quite often, but it's less common in dairies. Now, I've got down economics here because there was 2 recent papers, one from 2012 and one that's just been published or is in press in Journal of Dairy Science, looking at economics. And the one from this year shows a benefit, showing that if you will synchronize a heifer, you will get her pregnant earlier in that breeding period than if you're just using the prostaglandin. So that's a recent article that's out in Journal of Dairy Science and in press right now. And so you can look at, maybe we in the dairy industry, maybe we should be looking at trying to synchronize so we're breeding all the heifers the first day they come into the breeding pen. So here are the protocols. I can tell you from the DCRC, the two on the left are on the recommended list. The one on the right is not on the DCR list. It's on the beef cattle list. But it's a longer program where you put a CIDR in. 2 weeks later, you take it out, and you wait 16 days, and you have prostaglandin in the afternoon, so you're breeding 66 hours later. The two 5-day CIDR programs, and there's two variations. One, you can use a GnRH when you put the CIDR in, but if you do that, then it's important that you do the two prostaglandins, and it goes back to that early CL that could be developed there. So you need two. Now, if you don't use a GnRH when you put the CIDR in, then you only need to give the one prostaglandin. However, some data would say that you lose a little bit on pregnancies per AI by not using the GnRH. So whatever your system is, you can tweak it to what you want there. So once we got them bred for the first time, then we got to think about the resynchronization, because if your conception rate is 35%, that means 65% of the cows are going to be cycling back. And papers, if we look at economics or efficiencies, repro efficiency increases as non-pregnant cows are re-enrolled in as soon as possible. So to be re-enrolled, we need to have our earlier pregnancy diagnosis. Okay, and that's the key to doing the resynchronization. So here I list out the different ways we can do a pregnancy diagnosis, and we can see here when I was in practice too, typically we would be doing 3 pregnancy diagnoses during the cow's lactation. One is an early one. Once again, I tell students, I love to find pregnant cows. Love to find pregnant cows, but really where I help the producer is when I find the open cow and we do something about her sooner. So we'll do an early check and we do a recheck depending on the farm, 50 to 90 days later, 50 to 90 days of gestation, and then we do one for dry off. And historically, palpation has been the one we've used, more recently ultrasound, and even more recently the blood and milk tests. And I show you this chart, and you can see the advantages and disadvantages of each of those tests. So because the blood and milk tests are most recent, I wanted to cover those a little bit. And basically, when you talk, they both are looking for what's called a pregnancy-associated glycoprotein or a placental-associated glycoprotein. And they've been out here long enough that we know these tests are relatively accurate, especially when they're calling the open cow, and that's really what we're after with the early test. And so fairly accurate to use. You can work with your veterinarian to incorporate this into your system. I'm going to show you in the next slide that initially the pegs increase, but then they decrease, and then they increase again. And then I'll talk a little bit about that in the next slide. But also it should be noted that when a cow loses a pregnancy, it will take 7 to 14 days to return her to a non-pregnant status. And the picture here shows this. This is a cow from our University Dairy from Dr. Lucy's lab. And you can see we took a sample at the day of breeding, 5 days later, 12, 19, 26. We begin to see a change at day 26. Day 33, it's really strong that she is pregnant, but she loses the calf, and by a week later, it's already becoming dilute. And by the time she comes in heat at 42 days, it's quite dilute. So it's just showing you that from a pregnancy, if she loses it, it'll take 7 to 14 days to become what you would call non-pregnant. So now, if I mentioned the low point, or that the pegs in the blood or in the milk increase, and then they decrease, and then they increase again. And this first slide, and these are from a former grad student, Dr. Kai Poehler, and you can see day mid-30s days of gestation, it kind of hits a peak. And then by 45 days to 60 days of gestation, it kind of hits a nadir or a low point. And then on the next slide, you can see after that, it begins to rise quite quickly. And so this has led to some people recommending that if you're going to use the blood or the milk test, to do an early test and then wait to do a recheck until after 70 days or so. And so you kind of miss this low point. All right. So as a veterinarian, licensed veterinarian, I have my first disclaimer. These are the reproductive drugs that we use for synchronization. The GnRHs are on the left, factor L through cysterellin, and then prostaglandins, glutamate through prostamate, and the progesterones down at the bottom. Now, my disclaimer is today the FDA recognizes for synchronization you can use factor L with luteolase, or you can use fertigil with estromate, or GnRH with esterplan. And it should be noted that the GnRH esterplan was the first combination that was licensed for estrus synchronization, and it's actually the only one that's licensed both for beef and dairy cattle practice. So if you're utilizing a synchronization program, you should be using one of those three combinations. Also with the progesterones, if you use MGA, it's legal to use on heifers, but only heifers, not lactating cows. And of course the CIDR is labeled for that. So just a disclaimer as a veterinarian. Whoops, sorry. We have another poll. So gotten through the kind of the synchronization program part of the slides. So since the advent of synchronization programs, what have you been doing?
Well, Steve, we got a lot of choices here. I think I know what you're doing at HOARDS, but you may want to make a comment on what's the protocol out there at HOARDS Farm.
Well, we would probably be using both the estrus detection and the timed AI would be probably our most appropriate answer out there.
No bulls? Not using any bulls on the farm?
No.
Not at all. Okay.
Only to keep the weeds down in the bullpen. we don't use them per se. So.
Okay. Well.
And the voting's coming in pretty well there.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah. We were picked up a little bit. We got. I'm not sure what that means, but that either it's easier. But I thought the first one was pretty easy. Let's turn this off. We're at we're almost 70%. And Scott, any surprises there?
Well, I'm surprised that nobody picked bulls. I mean, we certainly have bulls out there, but I'm glad. Bulls are dangerous, and I have rarely ever seen a bull herd attain the same same pregnancy success that AI has. And I would say, if we look at the research, and as I was preparing for this, that really a combination of estrus detection and timed AI works quite effective. So I'm glad to see that as the highest, almost 75%. So, but certainly there are some herds where only a total AI program might work as well. So very interesting. Okay, so once again, we're going to get back. So we're going to talk about activity monitors, and really activity monitors are estrus detection aids. And the kind of the evolution of that is we've started out with these rump-mounted devices, and we see heat watch on these beef heifers, or we saw earlier the Estrotech patches, KMAR or chalking. We have radio telemetry as well as the newest one is the accelerometers, which we'll probably talk most about here. But what was interesting when I was looking at this is the pedometers actually first came about in the 1950s. I had no idea that they've been around that long. And one of the research says that, and it doesn't matter what kind of estrus synchronization or estrus detection we use, if we have these segs, which are sexually active groups, so the more cows we can have in estrus at one time, the better we are at detecting them. And so that's what the idea of synchronization and using these different devices to find cows in heat. If we can make more in heat at one time, we'll do a better job. So we'll move on to the activity monitors, which are kind of the newest technology that's out there, and I have had several of my clients and people I work with have gone to these, and very interesting. And so I'll just give you some experience and some of what the research says. So certainly these devices, you will have some false positives and false negatives. You know, they're not foolproof. However, if I look at the research, they're becoming less of these false positives and less of these false negatives. And I looked at one research from 2012 to 2015 went from 70% accuracy to almost 90% accuracy. And so they are fine-tuning these, and these are becoming much better, much easier to use, much better to use. And so I think we'll see these things gaining the use. Now, what is interesting is that these activity monitors, most of them, when they trigger, when they show up on the list as starting their heat, the time from there until ovulation is about 24 to 26 hours, which is very similar from when the cow has a normal GnRH LH surge to ovulation, which is about 26 to 28 hours. So therefore, the timing of recommending insemination, and some Canadian herds have, when they've gone to these monitoring systems, have gone to the AM/PM rule. So we had followed the AM/PM rule, where if we found a cow in heat in the morning, we breed her in the afternoon, and if we find her in the afternoon or evening, we breed her the next morning. And then we went to once a day breeding, and now with these activity monitors, it looks like we can go back to the AM/PM if we can figure that out within our system. And once again, combining an activity monitor with a sync protocol is proving to be quite effective as well. So activity monitors, if like I showed earlier, that estrus detection or detecting cows in heat has become harder, and if you're just using purely watching the cow, it's pretty poor. And these activity monitors, are what they should be doing and what they do to help is they're helping heat detection rate. We're going to see more cows, we're going to catch more cows in heat, and therefore our pregnancy rate should increase. And so here, there's several slides I'm going to go through from one of my clients that they allowed me to show you this. And so this is a typical data sheet that you're going to get out of these systems, and you're going to have the cow number, her lactation, her status, how many days in milk she is she for breeding, you know, how many times she's been bred. And this particular herd also has them on their heifers as well. But over towards the other end, you have a heat index. So it's saying, you know, how sure do I think this cow is in heat? And I will show you the graphs, and you can see how you could say the second cow is truly 100% versus the first cow is only 60%. Okay. This herd also uses ruminations as well, and I'll talk about that later. So here's that first cow. She actually is pregnant, and you can see on the system there on the right, she has an increase in activity, and so that's why it's saying, oh, she may be in heat. It only said about 64%, but you see down the two little arrows mean that she had a pen move. And so that's quite common. You'll see when these cows get moved from pen to pen, their activity goes up initially. And so the point of this is, once you get your list, look at the information and use that to decide whether you're going to breed a cow. Here's the second cow, and you can see 21 days ago she was bred. She was actually in heat. She was not bred, so you see a cow standing. And here, towards the right, we have her standing in heat as well, with quite increase in activity, but these little sperm cells mean that she was bred. And she actually got moved, and she was still quite active, and so the farm decided, you know, to put semen in her, from the adage that if you don't put semen in a cow, there's a 0% chance of her getting pregnant. So they went ahead and bred her a second time. But you can see quite active there. And then here's that heifer, and she was in heat and was bred. And then here we are 21 days later, quite active again. Really a nice plain graph showing that, you know, she's in heat again and she was bred a second time. So utilize your list of cows first and kind of go through them, and then if you have to, go look at what's happening here on the graphs as well. So on this herd, I just went back and I went the year before they put in the activity system and then the year since they have to compare. And this herd, actually, their conception rates have increased. Went from 34% to 42%. And even Ovsynch, the use of Ovsynch is a little bit less now, but that conception rate has also increased. So a good response. And then if we look at this is from Dairy Comp, at their heat detection rate, which is 59%, and their pregnancy rate, which is 20%, and this is the year prior to the activity monitors. Still really pretty good for a dairy herd. A pretty good herd. They at 20%, they already have excess heifers. In fact, they had already started breeding their low-end cows, the beef bulls, to keep from keeping so many heifers. So really pretty good. And then if we see here, a year after the activity system went in, we have jumped the heat detection rate to 61, and the preg rate went up 5 percentage points. Quite a good jump on a pretty good herd already. So they're really seeing a benefit from the system as of already. They've had it in for a little over a year and a quarter. So. Also, one of the things I noticed is if you go to Dairy Comp and you put the command into your command line, it'll generate this graph, and this is a survival curve. And basically, where I have the arrow, the red line is the first service, blue line is second service. So it's telling you the average days between our first and second service is 33 days. This is prior to the activity monitors. Okay. So on the average, they were breeding at 70 days, and on the average, the second breeding was at 103 days. After putting in the activity monitors, that actually dropped to 25 days, which I think has helped propelling, increasing that heat detection rate. So catching more cows earlier, which we've seen was a good thing. So remember, I told you, remember that scatter graph from the beginning? And this is beginning to look like that as well. And so this is from another farm that's using the activity monitors. And so this is kind of a advice when you go to activity monitors. So this herd is only using activity monitors, and you can see there's about 20% of the cows are getting past 90 days in milk at first breeding. I can tell you that before this activity monitor system went in, this herd would have it all below 90, and I think that when we're using the activity monitors, like I said, also using a sync program, or saying having a days in milk from which you would say, we're going to do something with a cow. Let's say you choose 80 days in milk if they have not been in heat, to synchronize them so you don't let those cows get so far out before you breed them the first time. So I think that's, as you use the activity monitor system, it's good to keep in mind that it would good to have a threshold of days in milk when you're going to do something for that cow if she has not shown you a heat. Okay, rumination time. Some papers would say you can use rumination time for predicting when a cow's in heat, but I show you by these two graphs, it can be a little bit tricky. I think you can use it as an adjunct to determine when a cow's in heat, but I wouldn't solely rely on the rumination time during the day to determine when a cow's in heat. Okay, next poll. Now that we covered the activity monitors, are you using some, or do you not have some, or would you like to use some? It'd be interesting to find out.
Well, we're off and running here. Steve, comments?
Yes, we do. We have had activity monitoring for several years now in our new system, and so we're somewhere between number 2 and number 3. You know, some health assessment, but mostly for estrus detection would be our case. So I probably would go with number 2 in our case.
So you've got the rumination collar as well, along with
we just have activity at this point. We hope to have rumination at some time, but not yet.
Okay.
And probably the herdsman out there tells me about half of our pregnancies result from activity and direct observation, and the rest from timed AI.
Well, Jim is getting antsy here. He closed it right off here. We got 71% in. That's our best turnout. And what an interesting mixture we have here, Scott. What's your diagnostics of the?
Well, I'm not really surprised. I would expect it to be pretty uniform because it's an early technology, and I certainly like the idea that people are thinking about it. My experience with some of the herds that have gone to it, which are really good repro herds, and they're actually doing better with the activity monitors. So it's very interesting, very interesting.
Okay.
So I should be able to get done here now. So here's the inline. So this is from D.V.M, and once again, it's only available in Canada now. It's a herd navigator, and it actually, in the milking system, it will test for progesterone. And so it starts a certain set time before your voluntary waiting period. It begins to take progesterone every 5 days or so. Once it gets a high progesterone, like here, and then a low, then it determines it must be in heat here, and so then it'll begin to test the progesterone in the cow 18 to 24 days later. So you can use that you might go for a breeding here. Insemination was right there. Yep, it's low progesterone. Once that happens, another insemination here, and then once it gets a high progesterone, it stays high, it'll keep testing it until out to about day 55. So it's a way to predict maybe when a cow is in heat, and it also can help maybe determine if she's pregnant. Maybe if she starts going high, you can have the veterinarian check her and make sure she's still pregnant. So this is something that's probably down the line yet. I guess someone D.V.M could tell us, but it's something that's in the future. And then I'm going to finish up here with a couple slides on health. As a veterinarian, I like to make sure the cows are healthy as well. One of the first things is the energy balance in the transition period. If we can keep a cow in a positive energy balance or negate a lot of negative energy balance, we can increase preg rates. And both these monitors can monitor for clinical or subclinical ketosis. And we know if more than 15 to 20% of the cows are experiencing subclinical ketosis after freshening, that our preg rates can drop at 1% or more. And so it's important for energy balance. The other thing is uterine health, and this is not a surprise, that we got to decrease retained placentas, we got to reduce metritis, endometritis, and we can do that. We can also increase pregnancies. And in my second disclaimer as a veterinarian is these three products shown are the three products that are labeled for treating metritis in a dairy cow. And then the final thing is less obvious, is there's two papers came out this year, Journal of Dairy Science and one in Therio, that says if a cow has mastitis or subclinical mastitis or a high somatic cell count, those cows are less likely to get pregnant. So not only milk quality important for shipping milk and selling milk, but it's also by reducing mastitis or high somatic cell counts, we actually will improve reproduction. And so with that, I wanted to end with these are the first three farms are farms that were my clients when I was in practice, and the fourth one is our university dairy. And I just wanted to show all four of these farms use some kind of estrus synchronization protocols. They don't use the same. The University of Missouri uses a timed AI and will ester detect for rebreeds, but the first service is completely timed AI. The others use different forms, but we can see how from 2003 till now, or 2006 till now with the university dairy, how these reproductive parameters, how we've improved those through those years. And I think genetically we are getting more cows pregnant by using DPR and sire conception rate and those type of things. But also I think by utilizing technologies and even all the way up to the activity monitors now, we are seeing increase or better fertility in these herds, and I think we can use those to continue to make our cow herd more fertile. And so with that, I think I'm ending up in a good time.
Very good. Yeah, very good. Scott, excellent job. Very interesting data and observations. a good explanation of the tools we have available and how they can be used and how much we can rely on them. So it's very interesting. And we thank you so much for your presentation, and also Parnell for their sponsorship of today's webinar. And again, as always, our thanks to Jim Baltz and Mike Hutchins down at the University of Illinois. Thanks to all of you for being with us today. Just a reminder that you in a few days will be receiving a survey asking for your reactions to our webinars, and we appreciate your response on those in order to help us make sure that our series are targeted to your needs. We appreciate that. And then also, as always, in a few days, this webinar will be available on our webinar archives at HOARDS.com, and all of the past webinars also are available as well. So be sure to take advantage of that and to let your coworkers and colleagues know that they can, if they had to miss this one or any of the others, that they can go back and view them, HOARDS.com, and go to the webinar section of our homepage or website. Just looking ahead now, December 14th will be our next webinar. Jeff Bewley, University of Kentucky, is going to be talking about some new technology tools similar to Scott, some of the points you covered, but also some different approaches as well. And there's lots of new things on the front there, and it'll be an interesting presentation, I'm sure, and it'll be brought to us by Kuhn North America. And then looking just a bit further ahead, January 11th, Mike Hutchins will be the presenter. Always an interesting and popular topic, feed additives, an update, probiotics, yeast, niacin, and various other things that we can put into our rations. And Mike is going to be bringing us up to date on research and observations on those. With those comments, Mike, I'll turn it back to you to see if there are some questions that we can deal with here.
Okay, very good, Steve. Scott, maybe you can click one more slide if you could, please. I think we have one more. We want to give our visibility to our sponsor here, because without them, we wouldn't have a webinar. So anyway, very good. Scott, we do have some questions. Are you ready to rock and roll?
Fantastic.
Fantastic. Interesting one. Instead of going to the 2 PG doses, can 1.5 dose work? I'm guessing they're talking about the size, the size of the dose. Can they cheat that about? Do you understand what the question is?
Yeah. So what we've been finding in some research, and we've done this on the beef side as well with Dr. Patterson, is that actually you need to separate those doses. So just increasing the dose isn't going to help you. You need the time difference between them. Now, given that, we typically go 24 hours apart, but some data would say we can go as just 8 hours apart, so you could do a morning and a evening dose of prostaglandin, but you should separate those. It's not a matter of just giving more at one time. It's the time difference in allowing the prostaglandin to, basically that prostaglandin starts release of prostaglandin from the uterus, so it's not just like, I should say, like Dr. Dick Wallace told me, it's not like flipping the light on harder that you'll make it go. It's that you prime the in utero release of prostaglandin as well.
Do you have an ideal preg rate that you'd like to throw out to our listeners as far as where they should be at in terms of preg rate?
Okay, so from experience, being in practice and watching herds improve, what I can tell you from experience is once you get around 20% preg rates, you will begin to have excess heifers. And this is not using gender-selected semen. This is simply getting your preg rates to 20% or above. You begin to have excess heifers. So that certainly would be my first target. After that, it depends on what you're doing. So if I'm working with a herd and their national average, which is 14 to 16%, my first step is to 20. And then once we attain there, and you have excess heifers, and you begin to, kind of clean up the herd and make voluntary culling a process, then you can begin to ratchet that up some. And so if I start at 20, I'm probably going to shoot for 25. And if I'm at 14, 16, I'm going to go to 20.
Very good.
So I hope that's helpful.
Yep, very helpful. Can you use the blood monitoring for early resynchronization?
So yes, the blood test. Yeah. So what's out there now, the several blood tests are there for 28 days. So you can go as early as 28 days to run the test. And yes, you can use that and run the test. Now, the downside is you're going to have to send that off at this point. And some veterinary clinics will run it. Otherwise, you send it to another lab. And so you're going to run it at day 28. It's going to take a day or two to get the results back, and then you can synchronize the cows or set them up. Or there's also other synchronization where you could have done a GnRH before this. But so it's not cow side, but it certainly can be utilized within those resync programs.
Why is the CL less than 6 days of age refractory and not responding to the PGF? So
less than 6 days, so it's what we call early, and a lot of times it hasn't fully luteinized. So it isn't completely luteinized, and so those cells aren't as responsive to the prostaglandin. Okay, so it's an immature, and the cells that the prostaglandin is going to go to interact with are immature, and so they don't respond as well.
Okay. We were looking when looking at your activity chart there. What are the units on the right side? Was that a percent or is a relatively? The rumination is usually minutes per day or something like that. What about the activity monitor?
Yeah, the activity monitor is going to be a percentage. So it's going to say, compared to a normal day, what percentage change is occurring. So, for example, cow 24, 25, normally she's running at that, 40, 50%, and if she jumps percentage-wise up to 100 or so, then that's saying she has increased that much. So it's not necessarily minutes per day, but it's looking at percentage of her time.
And is there a magic number you like to use? Are you looking at like doubling or?
No, so that's why you want to look at your list first, okay? And so you want to say, okay, when was she in heat last? Is she supposed to be in heat? What has happened? Did you do a pen move? All that other information kind of filters in. And then in this system that I showed, it has that heat index. And so that's the software itself is developing an algorithm that will say, like the one cow was 100%, we're pretty much 100% sure this cow is in heat at this time. And if you look at the graphing, you'd say, oh yeah, that's probably true. Look she's almost doubled her activity or the percentage. So I really want to take in that information and then look at the graph before I would just take the list and go out and start breeding all of them. I want to look at all the information.
So you don't foresee having a computer program making that decision. You as the veterinarian or the dairy manager should be looking at the data on each cow.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And my experience with working with these several farms that have put these in is, especially early on, and it's the same when we started synchronization, it's not a blind trust that, I'm going to just go do. And like the one herd, they still put Estrotec patches on. And so they're really kind of testing it against the Estrotec patches, but they're finding that it's working fairly well, but they also are going to go look at the cow as well. So, yeah, I don't think any of those software or those companies would say just blindly follow us. I think they want you to take in the whole information.
Well, here we go, Scott. I think after using heat detection technology, heat detection increase from, say, 59 to 61% is not an economical investment to get my money back with only a 2% increase. Do you want to make a comment on that?
So that's heat detection, right?
Yep.
And I appreciate that. It wasn't as much as I thought, but I think if we, if we can heat detect more, but that's not a big. But when I look at pregnancy rate, my pregnancy rate jumped 5%. So that's 5 percentage points. So if we use Dr. Fetro's economics and say each percentage point is worth $30 per cow in the herd, now that's $150 per cow in the herd. So that's yearly all the time, and so yeah, you have to look at the economics, but that herder already said, you know, we've already improved enough because the pregnancy rate, not the heat detection rate, but the pregnancy rate, we've gotten an economic value out of this heat detection activity monitors. And plus they're getting ruminations as well, so that's another sidebar.
So that begs the question, in your experience, these are good investments, economically speaking? So
yes, you have to improve your preg rates with them, but also I also have an example which I didn't put through here. Once you have this technology, please utilize it. You have to utilize it. If you put it in and you don't, no, it's not economic. But if you put them in and you follow them and you use them, what I'm seeing so far is they're bringing back the economics. They are paying you back.
Okay. Well, here's an interesting question. Which program would you prefer? Do you prefer cherry picking all cows at the time of AIing with or pre-sync or using? Let me restate that. I stumbled through that. Which program you prefer, cherry picking or all cows at timed AI with pre-sync?
So my experience is majority of the guys I've worked with will cherry pick. It's hard for them if they see cows in heat not to breed them. So a majority will cherry pick, but not all farms. Some farms aren't set up that they can do that. For example, we got even at our university dairy where we bring them over to a rail. Our first service is timed AI, and it works very well for us. So it kind of depends on the farm personnel, what facilities you have. But I would say in general, most guys will cherry pick, and I guess if I had a farm and I was doing it, I would probably cherry pick as well.
Okay, I think you've answered this, but let me read it to you. If you prefer cherry picking, can we inseminate the cows after the first PG?
Yes, you can, but typically we're starting that pre-sync early enough, like day 35 of after freshening, and typically your conception rates aren't going to be that good at that early. So typically we don't do cherry pick off the first prostaglandin, but usually the second one's around 50 days, 55 days, and then a lot of guys will do it. So usually not the first one because it's early part of the days in milk.
Interesting, Scott. I think I know the answer to this, but the question, could you use activity monitors after first breeding, which is synchronized?
Yes, you could. You could. However, you've got to get the activity monitors onto the cow and some time before. It has to set a baseline. So I'd almost argue that if we're going to do that, we got to put them on a cow. Just go ahead and get them on beforehand, and so it can set its baseline, and you'll have that baseline to work with.
Oh, interesting. Why only Canada can use the herd monitor from D.V.M? It sounds like it's not approved in the U.S., or what's the politics there? Can you give us any insight into that? So
hopefully, if you can contact your D.V.M. I don't think it's politics. I think it's just hasn't made its way. But hopefully, someone from D.V.M, you could contact them and ask them for sure. I'm sure they probably would bring it here. I don't think there's any legal issue with that, but I guess.
Scott, Steve Larson here. I think it's just because the meters that are a part of that system have not been given the final approval by the DHI, the herd recording program. I think that's the case.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Interesting. Well, Scott, another quick question, and that is, we've heard that people say you should have a certain percent of your cows pregnant in the herd at all times, assuming it's a year-round breeding program. Do you have a number to throw out there? In other words, should that be 50%, 60%? What percent of the herd should always be pregnant if you're really doing a good job?
Okay, so my experience in that last slide with the different herds, what I've found is that good reproductive herds will always have more than 50% pregnant at all times when you're in a year-round calving situation. So the 50% is really the target. Really, I've only really seen one year-round calving and it's a one dairy repro rewards quite a bit. They'll push up around 60%, but most of the time I'm targeting, if I'm doing year-round calving and I'm doing well with reproduction, I'm targeting at least 50% of the cows pregnant at all times.
We had a fairly long discussion, came in here from a listener from the UK, and let me just boil it down. He says they use glycerol, which would be a glucose or a sugar, build blood glucose, in cows to raise energy levels up to the insemination through conception period. And any comments on that in terms of blitzing these cows with extra energy during the reproductive window?
Boy, that's a good question. We have looked at glucose. Now, in the transition cow, we've looked at glucose levels along with the ketone levels, the BHBA, beta-hydroxybutyric acid. But I can honestly say I haven't looked at looking at glucose at the time of breeding. I can tell you from the transition, the glucose doesn't follow as nicely as the BHBA does in predicting what's going to happen later. So that's a good question, and I can honestly say I don't have a good answer for him.
Nor do I. One last question, and how long would you leave the monitor on a pregnant cow if you want to reuse the monitor? Do you have guidelines on that?
Yeah, so typically what I would want to do is leave that activity monitor on until that pregnancy recheck. So I'm going to do an early one, and then I'm going to do another one probably after 60 days. And then that's when after that second pregnancy exam to recheck the original pregnancy exam, that's when I would, if you're going to remove them and reuse them, that's when I would be doing it.
Very good. And here's the easy one. Do you think the Packers are going to win the Super Bowl?
Well, I'm pulling for them to win the Super Bowl. We'll have to play a little bit better than what we've had the last 2 weeks.
Well, you haven't answered the question. It's the first question you haven't directly answered. Yes or no, will the Packers win the Super Bowl?
Well, okay, so now I will go with yes.
Oh, boy. Steve, why don't you take over at this point and kind of wind up? We're out of questions and out of answers, I think.
I agree with him. Hope springs eternal, and it's a long season. And, we might peak in November and December. Who knows? So, hey, great job, Scott. Dr. Scott Poock, great presentation. Nice job with the questions, too. And we appreciate it very much, and we appreciate the support of Parnell for today's webinar, and always the help of Patty Hurchin here in our office up here. Mike Hutchins and Jim Baltzant at the University of Illinois be with us in November. I think that was, December, rather. The 14th, I guess it is, for the next webinar on new technologies on the farm. Dr. Jeff Bewley from the University of Kentucky will be with us all. And thanks for all of you for being with us today, and we hope to have you back with us on future webinars. So from Steve Larson up here at HOARDS Dairyman, we're signing off, and thanks again for being with us.